A lot of crossover there. Recording in progress. So we also throw a couple other social events. We have a nonprofit board reception where we invite all board members of our member nonprofits together. We're talking about bringing that back. Stay tuned. And we also put together Exton's Biggest Happy Hour. It's sponsored by our nonprofit council, and it was actually probably the last big event before the world ended. And we had quite a few people gathered together. It was just a great time. So our nonprofit council is just very strong. We're meeting, I think our next meeting is next Tuesday.
Yeah.
And it's going to be our first in-person meeting in several months. So if you're interested, you can shoot me a message or shoot Laurie a message. We'd love to have you join our group.
Thanks, Bill. You couldn't say it better. I mean, I couldn't say it better myself. So we just welcome you all here. And again, this is all a collaboration of great people on the council. I couldn't do this alone, and you'll see the list of the members currently at the end of this presentation. But you don't have to be a member to participate in any of our events. And we just want to have collaboration and support the community that way. So, oops, nope. Sorry about that. So let's get started. As people come on inside, I'll let them in. But in the meantime, I'd like to welcome everybody to In the Know for NPOs, almost everything. Who's next? Almost everything, as Sonia Stamm says, you need to know about succession planning. I know a lot of us, I'm a not-for-profit, I run a not-for-profit, but a lot of nonprofits and businesses in the area with COVID have had new challenges that they never saw before. But succession planning is something, whether it's planned or unplanned, is something that we as executives and board members have to deal with all the time. So I'm thrilled to be able to have this presentation today. And for people that weren't here earlier, this is our last Zoom presentation, yay! And in October, we will be meeting at the new Park Center, the Boy Scouts Park Center in Exton that is opening, I think, next week. So we will be meeting there, nice comfy seats and having a nice breakfast and coffee and an opportunity to really, whether you shake hands or fist bump or whatever, see each other in person and for more collaboration. Just a couple notes for housekeeping. This is an interactive presentation. We will be breaking out one time during the session, but if you have any questions, please raise your hand or write a question in the chat. Stephanie Stevens, one of our board members and nonprofit council members from the Chester County Community Foundation. Oh my gosh, already it's only 8:30. No, she will be fielding those calls. Also, we won't have a lot of time in the breakout. So if you would be so kind, or if you feel willing to, if you could put your contact information in the chat, I will share that with all the people that attended today. And then we will get that to you so that we don't spend a lot of time necessarily on the introductions, although that is pretty wonderful as well. And finally, I'm just doing a shameless plug for the Exton Chamber and would request your support. We are having our annual dinner on September 23rd at the beautiful Lochgarry Mansion, but we give away 2 awards, and one of those awards is some an award that would benefit also nonprofits. It's our Harold Martin Leadership Award. You do not have to be a business owner to to be nominated for this. And it's also very significant to a lot of people that I've been in contact with over the past year or so. And that is, It's intended to recognize a person from the Exton region who has achieved a significant and acknowledged level of success in their career and who has demonstrated leadership and a long-standing unselfish commitment to improving the quality of life in the Exton region. So the nomination form is on the website, or you can, which is extonregionchamber.com, or you can email me for that nomination form. The deadline is next Wednesday. So if you could help me with that in any way, that would be wonderful, because I know there are some great people even on this call that would we could honor. So with that, I have the distinguished pleasure. I think I have everything here, but I do have the distinguished pleasure of inviting our sponsor for this whole series, who joined the chamber probably early 2019 and has definitely has definitely made quite a difference to the chamber. And her name is Pam Leland, and she's from the Leland Leadership Group. So if I could figure out how to move to the next slide, that would be really good. But Pam, if you could take it from here. Again, thank you for all you've done for the chamber, for the Nonprofit Council, and for a lot of nonprofits in Chester County. So welcome.
Sure. Thanks, Lori, and I'll be brief, because what I get to do is introduce Sonia to all of you if you don't know her. But I work with nonprofit organizations, primarily, occasionally with a governmental body, but focusing on public service organizations around issues of strategy and leadership, and really focus in 3 areas: board governance, strategy, repositioning, and executive transitions. And I'm thrilled that Sonia Stamm can be with us today. She and I have known each other for almost 20 years. We met through we were both affiliated with the LaSalle Nonprofit Center, and have since both gone out on our own and done various things. But over the years, collaborating with one another has been a theme. We've worked on strategic planning projects and executive succession projects, and just tremendously talented individual, has great breadth of knowledge, came out of early in her career, was in executive search in the for-profit industry, and transferred those skills and knowledge to working with nonprofits. This is only one of the things Sonia does. She does a lot of organizational development work, planning work, and I think it's also, I'd like to highlight, she's recently become certified as a trauma specialist and is working on Train the Trainer program to take that knowledge and expertise to others. So I count her as a colleague, but also a good friend, and twisted her arm to be available today. And she had to rearrange her schedule to do it. So with that, I'll just turn it over to her. I think that's all you need from me, right, Lori?
It is, Pam, and thank you for that introduction as well. So without further ado, and thank you again for all you do and for bringing Sonia to my world. Sonia, I'll leave it over to you now.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Pam and Laurie. And I'm a little disappointed that I'm the last Zoom presentation and not the first in-person presentation, in part because right now I'm staring at both my photo and my Zoom square, and they don't look alike as much as I thought they were supposed to. Anyway, it's nice to meet you all. And thanks for that context, Pam. I actually want to speak to it. It occurred to me when you introduced yourself and you showed that you do work in board governance, strategy, and executive transitions, and mentioned that I had a background in search. It seems relevant to say I too do work in that sort of trifecta. And it's because when I transitioned back to the nonprofit sector from working in a boutique search firm with early stage technology companies, and some social service organizations. I realized when I was brought into the Nonprofit Center to create an executive transition program, people thought the magic was in the search, but I learned very quickly the magic is in what happens before the search or before the transition and after and during the transition, not just the search. And that's true whether it's an executive succession process or a board succession process. So the magic is really in the process, not the execution of a traditional search. And so I got into governance and board development and strategic planning because of board process, because you can't do executive transition without having a handle on what's happening with the board and what's the organization strategy. So they're really all very intimately connected. So as Laurie said, I added the word almost because in an hour or a year, I couldn't cover everything that's relevant to succession planning, but I do want to sort of talk about these key areas, why it matters, what are the essential elements in succession, what's unique about board and executive succession. And then we'll talk about some scenarios and some case studies before we wind up. So why does it matter talking about succession? First of all, it's inevitable. I used to start a board training with the announcement that your executive director and board chair are leaving. And everybody would have a mild heart attack and I would get dirty looks. And people would think that was imminent. And I said, and then I would say, it's not imminent. Nobody has announced it, but someday they might like to leave. It is inevitable. We can't keep people forever. So the one of the key roles of the board and the chief executive of a nonprofit organization is to be working on their legacy from the time that they get there. And your legacy happens through the creation of these processes and policies that are in place to survive you. So it matters because people need to be able to leave. And a succession or a departure, a transition represents a major crossroads for an organization. Whether it's good or bad or indifferent, it is a significant crossroads. It's an opportunity to look differently at the position, whether it's a board leadership position or a staff leadership position. It's an opportunity, but it could also create a hiccup for the organization. So it's a crossroads, needs to be taken seriously. And it's happening in the context of what's happening around nonprofits. The sector is growing. And the sector is, at this point, courtesy of COVID, kind of growing, I almost want to say out of control. The need is increasing exponentially, and the capacity is not. So there is growth. There's a leadership crisis. There's not enough leaders for boards or nonprofit organizations to lead the number of organizations we have. There's increased scrutiny on the sector. The IRS, all sorts of microscopes are on what the nonprofit sector is doing. There's increased competition for board members, for leadership, for staff. We see that throughout the marketplace, for-profit and nonprofit, but especially in the nonprofit sector. There's a bit of shared denial that happens in the nonprofit sector. I've seen this over the decades of my career, where Laurie at some point mentioned the nuance between a planned succession and an unplanned succession. And it made me smile because I thought, what is a planned succession? I think it depends on your definition of planned, because I've seen an executive director or a board chair say, I'm relocating in 9 months. So in the organization's mind, we planned for that. We knew it was happening. We didn't do anything, but we knew it was happening. So there can be shared denial around succession because people don't want it to happen on their watch. But it's an amazing opportunity and really helps to ensure the organization's sustainability when people take the planning part seriously. So I'm going to talk about what are the essential elements in succession planning. And I'm talking about both leadership, staff leadership, and board succession. I had organization asked me years ago, I was being interviewed as a consultant to help with a big leadership transition. The whole C-suite of a pretty sizable nonprofit was all retiring at the same time. It was a major event for the organization, and the board committee that was interviewing candidates, the board chair, I remember this very vividly, came from a large corporation, and succession planning meant something different there. And I was asked, what are the tools I'm going to use? I need to know what tools, what's your checklist? And I kept saying the most important tools are your strategic plan and a job description. And he didn't like that answer. I actually didn't get the assignment, which might have been an okay thing. A strategic plan tells you where you're going. Whether it's a comprehensive strategic plan or a shared strategic vision, it tells you where you're going. Because like in Alice in Wonderland, there's some quote like, where do you want to go? Don't know, then it doesn't matter how you get there. So if you know where you're headed, what organizations tend to do is they tend to look backwards. What did we have in the board leadership position or in the CEO role before? Let's hire that again. But organizations evolve, and it's likely whether the person was there 2 years or 20 years, that it's not the same organization. So you need to look at where you're going and hire for where you're headed, not for where you've been. So a strategic plan / shared vision is essential, and a job description. And I say that almost flippantly, but not so much, because at the board level, people are often permitted to imagine or reimagine what is the role themselves, as opposed to the organization and the whole board dictating this is what we expect of our officers. And similarly, it's common that the CEO or executive director of a nonprofit is asked to write his or her own job description. And they probably did when they started. They may not have updated it. And I assure you the job has evolved. So being clear about what is the job that you're asking for, I always, when I'm starting a transition process, I start with a comprehensive job description, even if they have one, because I flesh it out. What are the responsibilities and expectations in every category? And when a board and an executive director see that, they're stunned. And I promise them that they will not be able to find somebody who's equally adept in every area, but this is what the job is. So when you're looking at the job, no matter what job it is, since not one person can do it, part of the process of succession planning is looking at what are the other strengths in the organization? How will you complement this vacancy? So if the board is phenomenal at fundraising, maybe the executive director or CEO doesn't have to be the best fundraiser. Maybe they can invest in somebody who can learn that, because the board can complement that need in the meantime. Hope that makes sense. I'm talking to only a few faces, so I can't see you all. While looking at the strategic plan, hopefully you're revising or reaffirming your mission, your vision, and your core values. Core values tell an organization how it works. And so that's an important lens when you're looking at succession, because you want to attract people who share those core values. Having an emergency plan. Many organizations confuse a succession plan with an emergency plan. An emergency plan is, what if the board chair and or another board officer and or the CEO leave suddenly? We all talk about the proverbial bus, but maybe it's the lottery and maybe they're gone quickly. The emergency plan is, what happens? Who needs to be informed? Who's got the keys to the file cabinet and the office, and where is the redundancy in the organization? Who can step in and sign checks and communicate with key funders and ensure that the grant reports are in? Like, what are the immediate urgent steps that have to be covered? That's an emergency plan. That's a great first tool in succession planning, because it ensures that the emergency of the sudden vacancy can be covered, but it's different than a succession plan, because the succession plan covers the whole transition and the whole process. Job descriptions I've already mentioned, but it's important to have current job descriptions for every leadership position in the organization. And that should be regularly reviewed because, as I said, they evolve. Effective board process, effective management functions. Those are very helpful in succession planning. And helpful is kind of a euphemism for essential. Because if the board doesn't understand its role and isn't effective, and we see this a lot in an executive transition, if there's an executive director or CEO who's leaving, and especially if that person's been there for a long time, the board may or may not be at its best. It might have become accustomed to, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a word, abdicating some of its responsibility to its effective CEO. So the board function can get a little codependent, shall we say. And you can't replace the person you're codependent on. Like, you need to hold the reins. When you're recruiting, a new CEO is likely going to want to know that the board is a strong partner. So the board needs to look at itself, make sure it's a strong partner, and the management function needs to be strong. If it's a larger organization, knowing that the whole team is prepared for the leadership change and knows its strengths and where its vulnerabilities might be. And then finally, well, financial health, like if the organization is not viable, that's the emergency. That needs to be addressed. Not financially viable. If there is a potential, we're going to run out of cash before we finish this process, that needs to be addressed first, obviously. And then having a succession plan or policy is important. A lot of organizations think, oh no, somebody's leaving because we said it was inevitable. What do we do? So having something in writing, it doesn't mean the board chair is leaving, so that means the vice chair becomes the chair and the secretary becomes the treasurer. It doesn't necessarily mean that, nor does it mean the CEO is leaving, so therefore the board member whose job is the closest steps in. It's not necessarily personal. We don't have to know who it is. We need to outline a process for figuring it out. All right, I hope that makes sense, just kind of as an intro. Let's talk about board succession for a little bit. The board's role in board succession is not the executive director's job. It's the board's role in board succession. And I'm going to talk about the board's role in executive succession too, because that too is the board's job. First job, of course, of the board is to advance the mission. So it's not necessarily to replace the executive, the people who are, you're not looking necessarily to replicate the people in the officer's position. If the job is to advance the mission, you're not beholden to the organization per se, you're beholden to the mission. So you're looking for people who, and building a pipeline of people who get that and who are not married to the status quo, but are married to the mission. And as organizations evolve and as our surroundings evolve, it could be that a leadership transition happens at the board level or staff level, and it presents an opportunity. I'm just going to say this as a hypothetical, might present an opportunity for a collaboration that wasn't there before. And if the mission can be executed better as a joint venture or through a merger or through some other configuration, that's still advancing the mission. I often hear boards say that they keep officers in their positions indefinitely because they can't find somebody else to lead them. And that always makes me wonder, how viable is this organization if you don't have enough people committed to your mission? It also makes me wonder, is your board recruiting needing to be stepped up? Because are you recruiting people who just are there in body but not spirit? That could be a whole other session, board recruiting. So the board's job also is to promote sustainability and organizational alignment. So organizations evolve at different rates, different aspects of the organization evolve at in different ways. So promoting alignment with what the organization's doing and its capacity to do so is part of the board's job, along with promoting sustainability. So having as little disruption from board succession as possible is part of the board's job. And so the key elements in board succession, I typically think that this falls to a board development or governance committee. Ideally, that is functioning. It's not a nominating committee. That's kind of passé, because nominating suggests that it's just filling the vacancies. But board development suggests the health and wellness, the care and feeding of the board on an ongoing basis. So that makes board succession easier because it's being looked at continually. But one of the key elements there is looking at and defining and enforcing board terms and rotation. So you know in advance whose term is ending, what skill sets are leaving when that happens, and you're looking, let's say this is almost trite, but if we want to have a lawyer on the board, we know that that person's term ends in 2022. We should be looking for other attorneys who bring other skill sets that we're looking for. Maybe we need representation from banking, or maybe we want representation from a different geography. So it would be great if we had a lawyer who understands the financial services industry, who lives in X area. So that's an ongoing process. And assigning succession as a task, I just said it kind of belongs with the governance committee or board development committee, but it's a task. It's not an afterthought. It's not it's that time of year, we should look at our slate. It's an ongoing process that makes it most effective. Some of the challenges, of course, in board succession are continuity in terms of leadership of the organization. Like I said, some board chairs, some officers perceive it as, oh, it's my turn, I get to leave my fingerprint. But hopefully the role is leaving a fingerprint on the individual, more so than vice versa. Certainly leadership style matters, vision matters, but the role, the job, it's a job, it's an unpaid job, is the same. Consistency of vision and direction. The strategic plan doesn't necessarily change because the leadership of the board changes. And I see that happen a lot. I actually, years ago, I had a board chair call me asking me for help to fire their executive director. This is a true story. And I knew immediately this was not this is not a management problem. They weren't speaking to the executive director. It was a very small nonprofit. They weren't speaking to her because she wasn't doing the job right. And long story short, they had had a long time board chair for 10 years who liked the organization as it was and gave the executive director great reviews for 10 years. A new board chair came in, recruited his contemporaries to the board, and they no longer wanted to be a status quo organization. They wanted to grow it. And they perceived that the incumbent was not the right person, which was probably true, but they hadn't communicated that in any way. So I said, do you have a strategic plan? No. Do you have a job description? No. How will you know the right person when you see them? And they said, well, just know it. So that was an example of different board leadership deciding to take the organization in a different direction, which can happen. But ideally, the whole board is on board with, we have an opportunity to make change here. How do we want to do that together? And working in partnership with the executive director might have been a better way to approach it. Having a pipeline of leaders. There's a lot. One of the scenarios I think I wrote was, what happens when you have a vice chair who never wants to ascend to the leadership, to the board chair role? I always wonder, why did they say yes to the other officer position? Having a pipeline of people who want to lead, who are prepared to lead the organization, is essential. it shouldn't be, I see it a lot where, like I said, there are board chairs in place for decades because nobody else wants to do it. So people join the board knowing they never have that responsibility. That's not necessarily a best practice. And so when you choose officers and build that pipeline, you want people who are available and engaged and not doing it because they got strong-armed. And I know I'm talking about a lot of worst case situations, but I think it makes sense that when the consultant gets brought in, it's usually following something that didn't work. So I see a lot of that. So the flip side is, how do you do this successfully? You have succession planning policies, processes, and tools, and I've already mentioned what the tools are. You clarify a path in board succession to the leadership roles. Like I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be secretary, treasurer, vice chair, chair to ascend to the leadership role. Because by the time, if I started as the secretary when the organization was in a status quo mode, and ascend to the leadership role when the organization must evolve because there's an opportunity or a funding change and we have to grow, and I'm not a growth person, then you've misaligned your leadership with your organization's needs. So you always want to be looking at, how do you build your leadership capacity by building the strengths and skills of the individuals in leadership roles and picking which one is the right person at the right time. So you're recruiting for now and for later when you're building your board. So board recruitment is an essential element in board succession. And look at your processes regularly. Look at how they align with your organization's life cycle. Even if your organization seems to be standing still, to stand still in water, you're treading water and you're moving quickly and hard. So even if it appears to be standing still, it's moving quickly and working hard. All right, so that's board succession in 120 seconds or less. Let's talk a little bit about executive succession. First of all, we should define terms. I already mentioned an emergency plan is different than a succession plan. Your emergency plan is what happens when the person says, I can't come back for 3 months or 6 months or at all. Then you activate your emergency plan, and everyone on the board and everyone on the staff knows what their job is, who the important people is, how we're going to communicate what's happened, and we're not going to react as though we're in a crisis because we've already reassured ourselves that we can handle this crisis. We have a roadmap, and we're going to communicate that to external stakeholders. That goes a long way when the board and staff work together to show, yes, there's a situation and we are handling it. That goes a long way. Having an executive transition process is different than the executive search. The search is the identification and selection of the candidate to replace whoever's leaving. But the transition process looks at how ready is the organization. How ready is the organization for the change? What needs to happen in the organization to get ready for the change? And how do we help this new person be successful once they get here? It's not just, here's the keys, good luck with your job. And so many boards are exhausted by the time the new candidate is hired that's what they do. And it's not intentional, but that person is not set up for success. So in terms of the board's role, I told you I talk about the board's role in executive succession. It's having the policies, the plan, and the tools, job description, things that we've talked about. It's making sure that the preparedness of the organization is assessed. And that so frequently gets overlooked. We're ready because our executive director is leaving in 8 weeks, so we're ready. You're ready to maybe pick somebody who may or may not work out and will wind up being an interim, even though that wasn't your intent. So readiness has to do with, what's the financial picture? Where are the vulnerabilities in the organization? What's the opportunity? What do you wish you had? what's in the incumbent's head that isn't anywhere else? How are you going to extract that? That's sort of part of what readiness is. Having a transition committee, I like to have a transition committee and a search committee because they're different. And they can't, most of the time, they can't do both. If you're working on the search and you're looking at candidates and you're doing the interviews and you're, meeting candidates and doing that whole process, there's a lot of choreography there and a lot of thought and a lot of time, especially if you're doing it by Zoom. And the transition is very different. The transition is what needs to happen, where are all the documents related to governance, and what's the process for getting checks signed, and what's, like I said, in the incumbent's head. So two separate entities are managing those two processes. The board should participate in informing the job description, informing the criteria, maybe meeting the candidates. I like when the board gets to meet at least the top two candidates. Communicating with stakeholders, that's so important. Making sure that the board has said very clearly to the external community, here's what's happening. We got this. We have a process. We're on top of it. Hopefully we're inviting constituents to have some sort of voice and input during the assessment process. You can ask your key stakeholders, what do you think we need? And always there's a surprise in that. And then supporting the integration. As I said, it's not over when it's over. The board needs to partner with this new person. The board's job upon hire is to make sure that this new person is successful. That's the only job there. And that's a big job. And it's not to say, here's what you did wrong. Here's what you did wrong. It's here's where it looks like you might need help. Let us figure out a solution. All right. So the challenges, as you can imagine, I mean, we've already really talked about them: readiness, clarity on roles. Is it planned or unplanned? And if it is planned, is it planned? Do we have funding for this? I was thinking about this morning, early this morning, shower thoughts. The funding community has done us a service and a disservice. The funding community has often said to nonprofits, at least in the past, we're not funding you at your regular rate until you've replaced your executive director, because we don't know what's going to happen, which is a disservice, because obviously we need the funding to be able to do an effective transition process. But the reason I think that they do that is they're recognizing it's such a crossroads. It's such a critical moment. Are you still going to be viable? Are you hiring the right way? So asking funders to invest in the process to ensure that you do, funders are starting to realize the importance of that. Another challenge in executive transition is the inclination or the temptation towards shortcuts. There are no shortcuts. I can think of a million shortcuts. Pam and I, many years ago, worked with an organization on, the project was supposed to be succession planning, and it was intended to be a 2-year process. And they had a strategic plan. The incumbent had been there for over 2 decades. Long story short, very sad case. The incumbent wound up getting a terminal diagnosis and passed quickly. And initially, when we started, everybody was very clear, the incumbent and the board was very clear that the assistant director was not the right successor. And that's who got hired, because the grief was so overwhelming and the panic set in, and they hired that person who wasn't ready. And maybe emotionally that was the right decision in the end, because if the board could be clear about, here's where she's not ready, but here's what we're going to do to support her, that could be a success story. And in the end, there was success and challenge in that situation, just in case you're wondering. So don't take shortcuts. In terms of successful strategies, consider hiring an outside consultant. I know that sounds self-serving, but strategic planning and leadership transition, I think, are 2 of the most important areas that nonprofits would benefit from an outside facilitator of the process, because there's a lot of detail work in this, and having somebody kind of choreographing and bringing objectivity and taking some of the emotion out can be very helpful. Clarify expectations and roles, who's doing what. One of the key roles to clarify is the staff role and the incumbent role. Many boards, this is how it sometimes happens in the for-profit sector. So many boards expect that the CEO or executive director will identify his or her own successor. But that isn't that person's job. It's really the board's job, working in partnership, definitely be informed by the incumbent. But it's the board's job to establish the vision of where this organization's going. And I recently worked, well, we can talk about that in the scenarios, but a founding ED named his or her successor, and I'll tell you later how much of a disaster that was. Preparing the materials that you need, the tools, the checklists, the binders, the transition guides, and the job description and the interview screens. Like, there's lots of tools to be prepared. Interview screens for the telephone, start on the telephone. Interview screens for the committee's first round of interviews. I always have a second round, which might involve staff. So that's the role of the staff. The staff is not to decide, here's who we want. The staff is to participate by informing the job description, meeting top candidates, and giving some sort of input, giving the hiring committee input, but not making the decision. So it needs to be very clear whose role is what. Making sure that your hiring process aligns with your life cycle. Again, looking backwards, the up and coming leader who was able to grow with the organization for 20 years has created an organization that is now 20 years older, and probably needs somebody who can take it, who has experience in taking it to the next level, not who was in the startup and grew it to where it is now. So you want to align your criteria with your organization's actual capacity needs and life cycle. I hope that made sense. I think that's sort of a big overview. I told you that's almost everything, and it's a very quick introduction. So let's talk about some case study scenarios. Laurie, if we could go to the next slide. Okay, so I mentioned that I was going to talk about some of the not best practices, although I do want to say I have seen it work very well. And when it works very well, I'm thinking of a executive director of a multi-million-dollar organization that had a very smooth planned transition. And it's because everybody stayed in their lane and nobody either picked up or lost speed. You have to maintain your speed in your lane. You don't get to go to sleep, and you don't get to get hyper overstepping or move too fast because you're in a panic because somebody's leaving. Stay in your lane, maintain speed, and know your process. So I just mentioned this. The retiring founder handpicked a successor for the ED position. And unbeknownst to her, I mean, this sounds extreme, but it happened easily. Unbeknownst to her, the person she picked was involved. She knew her from a professional association. I'm trying to be very vague here. And unbeknownst to her, to the founder, that the successor had a hidden agenda, which was to reduce the effectiveness of the nonprofit because it was going to help her in a different way. And she was in cahoots with the board chair. So the founder stayed on the board, which is not a best practice that I recommend, and watched this horrible thing unfold. And it took the board months and months and months to recognize that the staff knew it immediately. The staff could feel it immediately, but they didn't have a grievance process. They didn't have a way for the staff to alert the board in a way that the board was responsive. So by the time it happened, they were literally in trouble with the IRS. So the founder needs to communicate the vision. That the founder probably owns the vision, but ideally the board has shared that vision and doesn't have to stay in a person because it's integrated into the institutional knowledge of the organization. Everybody's job is the legacy, and everybody's job is the vision. So have multiple people involved in the selection of successors. These are all true. A small group of board members pressured an incumbent to leave because in this particular case, it was 2 board members who didn't understand the role of the nonprofit executive compared to a business leader. And they didn't like some of the financial practices. So they pressured him into leaving. And then the board thought about, what do we need? And some wanted, a financial savvy business executive just to step in and handle the operations and the finances. And others were like, but you're missing the opportunity to look at how does this organization fit in this community? There was a growth opportunity there. So that was an interesting battle. We did an assessment and heard from the community, and that's how they got through that. I wonder if these are familiar to any of you. These are common situations. A new ED and a new board chair didn't get along. And that's because the new board chair didn't participate in the hiring process. So I would say the board chair, in my opinion, should not chair the transition process, but should absolutely participate. And if you have a new chair being groomed, first of all, I love when, if there's a new ED, I love when the chair and the ED do not change at the same time. So I believe if the ED is leaving, you can ask your board chair to extend, make an exception, ask the board chair to stay for another month, another year, so that you don't have them both leaving at the same time, because somebody needs to lean on somebody. And if they're learning at the same time, they are less strong. So they didn't get along because the new board chair hadn't been part of the process, hadn't been consulted, had some opinions. So there are ways to involve players so that that doesn't happen. And in this case, they needed some organizational development work with the whole board to make sure that the new board chair and the new ED understood the board's role and the board chair's role and what they wanted that partnership to look like. It's a partnership that needs to be designed and talked about. It's a marriage. I have a situation right now where there's an incumbent who announced he was leaving, and the board hired somebody, and the incumbent didn't like that person and has decided he doesn't want to leave. That's playing out right now. And what's going to happen is the board's going to have to understand its role, have conversations, and say, here's why we are confident in this person. Here's the day that you're leaving, and hold that person to it. I already talked about the vice chair not wanting to ascend to chair. I see that so commonly, and I get it. If I'm the vice chair, I've got plenty to do. I don't want the responsibility of being the chair. But what that does is it blocks somebody in the chair position from having a front row seat and being groomed to take over. Not that that's necessarily automatic, but it is a nice way to build board skills and leadership skills in board officers. And I already talked about this too. The secretary is set to rotate to the treasurer position, but isn't comfortable with numbers. So again, it doesn't need to be an automatic, first you're the secretary, then you're the treasurer, then you're the vice chair. You really have to match the person to the position and to the organizational life cycle and to the moment in the external environment. So it's all about intentionality. And so often in the nonprofit sector, because boards are busy, board members are volunteers, board members are busy. So the intentionality can be the first that is sacrificed. Like, let's just make it work for now and we'll deal with it when we have time. But making it work for now can create trouble later. I can't talk as fast as I can think. All right, are there any questions or anything before we do any kind of case studies? I'm not seeing the chat, so can somebody tell me?
You're actually good. There are no questions at this time.
Okay. All right. So do we want to do a little breakout?
Yeah.
Some case studies? All right. So I was thinking that we could do this first one as a group. So we'll divide into small groups for a breakout. And I think you've already been invited to put your name and introduce yourself in chat so as not to spend time necessarily in the breakout room. But I think this first one is an interesting thing to consider. The founding executive director of 25 years announced the retirement last year, and the board independently hired someone who lasted for 2 days. Literally, this happened. So then the board brought in a consultant, yours truly, to facilitate the process. What are the immediate priorities in that situation? Your founding ED wants to leave. The board has already hired, it didn't work. And by the way, the board blamed the incumbent ED for it not working. And the incumbent ED blamed the board for it not working, of course. So you get to this, what are the priorities for this organization? Let's start with that question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Who else?
So group one kind of had very similar thoughts as group three, but we also thought it was really important to talk to the employees, because this is a major, yank of the carpet under you kind of situation. So it's reassuring them as well, so they can continue to help their constituents or whatever the mission is.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Thank you. Another group?
We just said the same kinds of things. We thought it was important for the board to step back, take a look at what happened, figure out who is running the show right now, possibly look at an interim director, and obviously getting some support through a professional consultant and trying to regroup before they go forward and try it again.
Great suggestions. Great suggestions. You're all totally on track. Anybody else want to jump in before I tell you what happened? Go ahead, Pam.
I think for me, and of course, hindsight is always 20/20, but what were the warning signs that somebody should have been looking for? And the one that stood out to me, and I don't know this scenario, this situation, although Sonia and I certainly have lots of war stories, but if I were a candidate assuming the position of the executive director, I think I would have wondered why I hadn't been introduced to the ED. And for me, that would raise flags. And so that invites me to wonder about the candidate and, what he or she thought they were bringing, and why they thought they knew everything they needed to know to make a good decision. So it's really just raises more questions, but it also, I think, as our group discussed, I mean, there's responsibility all around here. So
Very astute. Very astute. I did have to tell, well, I'll tell you in a second. Does anybody else want to offer thoughts? Go ahead, David.
There we go. One of the things that I thought was just kind of important is that maybe on the board that the hiring committee weren't the right people. A lot of times board committees are composed of whoever reluctantly goes, yeah, I'll do it. you know, and so I wondered if they, during the hiring process, were, excuse me, the best people to choose to represent the mission. So did the new ED come in? And also too, I'm kind of imagining maybe this person's never been an ED before, so they didn't know they should have met the other ED or should have asked questions. They were just excited to be promoted, if you will. You talk to 2 or 3 people from a board, they're going to paint you a picture. And then on day 2, you get in there and have a meeting with the executive committee, who was not the hiring committee. And all of a sudden you realize, whoa, this is not what I was told. So miscommunication truly is, I think, is the biggest takeaway. I can sit here and suppose all day long, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say about what really happened, because this sounds like a lifetime story.
I thought so too. And I now think that we should be a consulting firm together, because I love how you're all thinking. So in the interest of time, I will tell you, well, first of all, our group, the group I was in, if I may speak for you all, one of the suggestions they made was ask the ED to stay, the incumbent, because you're in a crisis. And that in fact did happen. Or consider bringing in an interim. So we had a conversation about an interim and an acting, which I'm going to come back to. And then we talked about having the board circle back to understand the role. So here's what happened. So to your point, it was the executive committee was serving as the hiring committee, and somebody on the executive committee vehemently disliked the executive director, who was the founding executive director, but no love lost between those two entities. So the executive committee created its own job description, never showed it to the executive director, who was furious and felt unappreciated and displaced. Hired somebody, to your point, David, who had never been an executive director before, because they didn't understand what they needed. So it wasn't aligned, their hire wasn't aligned with where the organization was or with what the role was. So she got traumatized and left. The executive committee blamed the executive director blamed the executive committee, and yours truly came into this firestorm. The executive director wanted to leave last year, so there was urgency. We started in September. They wanted the search done by Thanksgiving, and they just hired, because that's how much there was to do. So the first thing that I said as a consultant was, it's time to bring in an interim. You've only had, that's something we should talk about in transitions. It is often a good idea to bring in an interim, because the interim, the candidate that you hire might wind up being an interim accidentally, if all the readiness factors are not in place. So the difference in my mind between an interim and an acting is just holding the reins and having a figurehead that's necessary while the board does the work of the transition. But an interim is actually going in almost like an internal consultant to see what's happening and help prepare the organization to be ready for a permanent person. So maybe the board leadership needs to be developed. Maybe the finances are questionable. Maybe there's some other fire burning and you have to put out the fire before you are in a position to attract the right person. So they should have had an interim, but they didn't want one. So the incumbent stayed for another year, angrily. The board then started to look at, what did we do first? We did some board development first. We did some work so that the board and the ED could understand their roles and stop stepping on each other. So we got everybody closer to their own lane. Then we developed a shared vision, because they didn't have a shared vision. The board had kind of abdicated to the founding ED, and the founding ED had a specific area of interest, which wasn't the whole mission. It was a piece of it. And there were board members who wanted to expand, and she wouldn't let them. And nobody was right and nobody was wrong. Like, these are volunteers. So we did a shared vision to figure out where's the organization heading. And then we created the job description so that everybody could see what it really was. And even though the one person on the executive committee didn't want the incumbent to see the job description, I said, you're not in the job. This person has to look and tell us if it's real. And then she felt appreciated because she saw a 3-page job description, every area of responsibility, and she then felt comfortable that they knew what she was doing and that they knew what they were looking for. Then we started both the transition. So somebody was working with her to sort of get things out of her head, and we all started a search looking for the unicorn that could do all those things. So the things I wanted to bring to your attention was the interim. Consider it, especially after a founder leaves or after a long-term ED is leaving. And sometimes at the board level, like if somebody's leaving and nobody's prepared to be the board chair, maybe have an interim or co-board chairs or some other solution so that you have the leadership you need in the short term while you figure out how you're going to solve the problem permanently. And I love that one of the groups talked about committee composition, have the right people on the search committee and the transition committee. I believe staff should not be on the search committee. They should be on the transition committee, and they should participate in the search through interviews and such. But they're hiring their boss. They should have input, but they shouldn't design the process. And I love that you said communicating with stakeholders, including staff. Staff and volunteers are key stakeholders in this situation. And if they lose confidence in the board or in the organization, you're in bigger trouble. And somebody in our group said, I wish I had heard this before, I would have used it. Hire slow, fire fast. At the board and staff level, and volunteers too. Hire slow, it's a process, no shortcuts. Fire fast, if it's not working, don't linger. So thank you for all of your contributions. That was great. How are we doing on time, Laurie?
We're close to being over right now. I don't know if we have another chance for a breakout, or if people want to stay on a little longer, we can talk about that. But we are at 9:35 right now. So I'm thinking it might be a good idea just to
Have questions?
have any questions. Exactly. How about that? And then I'll share these case studies with people if they want to just, bounce them off their board as well, in the future. So we can do that if that works for people. Does anybody have any questions?
I did have a question. Can you speak a little bit about what the current ED's, executive director's role would be with the board, whether they should be, what is their role in that hiring process?
Great question. So you're talking about if the incumbent ED is leaving, what is their role in the process? Okay. It varies by organization. Here's what I recommend. And as I just illustrated, to some degree, it depends on the relationship. Let's assume it's a healthy partnership. The ED should be focused on informing the job description, like announce that you're leaving, give the board plenty of time, hold the reins, you're still in charge, but let go of the control of the board in replacing you. It's not your job and it's not your problem. It's your role to help them, but not do it for them. So begin to separate yourself as the ED, inform the job description, make recommendations on who should be on the committee, make recommendations for a transition team and a search team. So make recommendations. You'll probably be involved in the transition work because people need to start extracting information from your head. So make sure the ED should be making sure that the emergency plan exists in writing and is accurate and current. considering, where is everything? What are the deadlines? Maybe create a calendar to show what's supposed to happen every month, every week, every quarter, annually. So start putting to paper, and work with presumably a subcommittee of board and staff on showing people how things get done or how they need to get done. Make a list of the things that you didn't get to so that somebody else can, things that you want done and you want your successor to prioritize. So there's a lot of information and a big role that that person has, but it's not in doing the board's job. And somebody I was talking to recently, I talk faster when it's closer to the end. Somebody I was talking to recently said, in a healthy transition, in a optimal transition, said, I wasn't prepared. She, as the ED, wasn't prepared for how quickly she felt obsolete. And it wasn't wrong. Everybody was doing what they were supposed to do, but she had to let go of the future. And often leaders are thinking of what's next. So she had to let go of the future, and it was very hard for her. So board, remember that, and maybe have, career counseling or life coaching or some way to support the outgoing ED, because it's hard. Oh, and that's another element to the transition process. How will you celebrate the person who's leaving, and how will you welcome the person who's coming? That's part of transition. And welcoming means not only introducing to the universe, but also supporting that person's early success. Great question.
Can I add, since we're short, one of the things that I think is something, especially if there's a transition where there's a very positive relationship between the board and exec, that kind of partnership that Sonia was talking about, you have to remind the board they're hiring for the future, not the past. And you have to say it over and over and over, because there is that positive relationship. People want to have that same person. They want to rehire the person who's leaving. And that message of this in no way doesn't appreciate the person who has served us so well for so many years, but we're not hiring for where we have been. We are hiring for what is coming. And again, how do we help boards embrace that without feeling they're being disrespectful of the leader who's departing? It's a constant message that Sonia and I have said together and separately.
And so that's why it's really important to help part of the process include some sort of celebration of that person's legacy, if it's a positive relationship and if there's been positive impact. And even if there hasn't, frankly, stakeholders will be looking for how is the organization recognizing this person's contributions? Nan?
You mentioned very briefly about the notion or idea of co-board chairs. And that's something we've been throwing around at our organization as a possibility, because we're looking at putting together a succession plan, or there's a lot of change going on as far as a board transition is going. And I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that very briefly, like what does that look like exactly from a responsibility perspective, the whole concept of co-board chairs?
So I think it depends, and Pam, jump in whenever you like. It depends on the personalities and I think the stage of development, but when I've seen it, I haven't seen it work. I haven't seen it that frequently, but when I've seen it and it's worked, they divide the functions of the board chair. So maybe somebody is responsible for logistics, like meeting scheduling and some aspect, and the other person is responsible for let's say attending the committee meetings and such. So they divide very clear areas of responsibility instead of both trying to do both, everything. Pam, what would you add?
I would agree. I think, and they also have to be people who like each other
And trust each other.
and want to be a team. You know, I will also say I'm a little bit skeptical of anything, although I know in the nonprofit management field, we're seeing a lot more call for co-leadership at the director level, because of the burden of being a leader. And it's coming from our younger generations. But in my experience, often the decision to go for a co-leadership is because nobody's willing to do it. And it's a way of getting people to say yes, because they perceive it will be easier. And frankly, I think co-leadership can often be harder because of the need for strong coordination, strong communication that has to go on to make it work. So again, I think Sonia started by saying it depends on the circumstances. And as with everything, it depends on the circumstances.
And sometimes maybe it's not co-leaders, maybe it's the chair and the vice chair divide their responsibilities different so that it's more manageable for the chair.
Thank you.
Don, do you have a question, Don?
Yeah, I'll just make sure I'm off mute. Yes, my question is, how involved should the ED be on recruiting? And also from a board chair type of position, how involved to direct that process too?
So I know there's a difference between practicality and ideal. So I recognize that. Do you mean the first part of your question is that how involved should the ED be in recruiting board members or candidates?
I would say candidates.
Okay.
To bring to the board, and then, you know, knowing that our board president's been there for quite some time and always asks, you know, does anybody, you know, want to take this position? And he gets it by default, basically.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm trying to look at that succession planning and see that they're going to need some help with this.
Mm-hmm.
And before I get myself in a bad position, you know, how involved should I be?
So that's a great question. And I think I might have intimated this earlier. The first step in board succession really should be effective board recruiting or an effective board recruitment process. So the ED's role is to support that process. You know, the ED probably knows lots of people, but the board and ED in partnership have to come up with a process that profiles the board, looks at, you know, who do we have, what do they bring in terms of skills and talent and connections and such, what are we missing, and then to design how are we going to get the word out, cast the net, and bring those people in. So everybody on the board, everybody on the staff could say, oh, I know a person who meets that criteria. Here's this person's name. And then the board subcommittee, the board development committee, has a process for vetting those, you know, connecting with those people, vetting those people, etc. So everybody could fuel the pipeline, but the board has to have a process, and the ED should play a role. The ED, you know, might be the person going with a board member to talk about the organization and kick the tires. I wouldn't want to join a board if I didn't meet the ED and understand how that person works. So that person should be a participant, but shouldn't drive it, shouldn't be solely responsible. Does that answer your question?
It gives me direction, yes.
Okay. Again, that's the 60-second answer. Anything else?
This was awesome. Now I know. Oh, this was really a great presentation, Sonia.
Thank you.
Pam, and I know Christine had a piece in bringing this to happen, still on the call. Thanks for doing this. As I mentioned before, we do have a fantastic nonprofit council. and this is listed over here. We all collaborate. I couldn't do this by myself ever. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Sonia, Pam, for being the sponsor and participating. And I hope we see you all in October on the 15th at the park, the new park center for the Boy Scouts of America. We're still working on the topic, but I hope to see you then. As someone had asked before, are we going to have this recorded? I mean, it is recorded. We will share this with everybody, and it will live on the chamber website. I mean, not website, the YouTube channel, which is on our website. Anyway, I don't know if anybody else has any other questions. I will also share the chat with everybody if you put your information in. And I'm so happy that I started my Friday with you all this morning. So I know I had a lot of takeaways. I know a lot of my board members were here today as well, and I couldn't be more appreciative. So without further ado, if no one else has anything to say.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to have you in person someday soon. I'll tell you what, maybe we'll have a
Okay.
Sonia show for something. So, okay.
Thank you.
Have a great
And
one.
thanks, Pam, for the referral.
Okay.
Bye. Happy weekend.
Have a great
Thank you.